Welcome back to the Journey. We are on this trek through Scripture and looking for life application as we just walk through the books of the Bible. And this week we're in 1 Samuel, and 1 Samuel is another book of transition, and it seems like we've been experiencing transition after transition after transition. And we're going to talk about those transitions just as a way of recap. But one of the things I just want to make note of today that I really hope you've grasped is that in Scripture we have these people that God uses. And so if we were going to retrace the history where we're at thus far, we would see that the God of Scripture, the God of the Bible, is a God who cares about and uses people to display His glory. And that's cool. And so if we begin with Abraham, that God came to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and He called him. He called him by making him some promises. Promises to give him a great land, a great name, that He would make him a nation or a people, and that He would bless the whole world through him, but that he needed to trust Him, and so that meant going to a place that he didn't know, trusting that God would get him there. And God made him a promise that He would do that, an unbreakable promise God made. It says Abraham got up and left, not knowing where he was going. He just simply trusted God. And by the time we get to the end of Genesis, we meet Joseph in Egypt. He has risen to power, and God builds a nation there in the country of Egypt. 400 years pass. And the Israelites, God's chosen people, they have grown. They are a big people. And the Egyptians take notice of this, and they say to themselves, we need to enslave them. Otherwise, if they decide to rebel, they'll overtake us. And so they begin to enslave the Israelites. And then God calls another man, a man who was actually kicked out of Egypt. God calls to him from a bush that burned but wasn't consumed. God said, I've heard and I've seen the misery of my people. Moses, go. And Moses says, no thanks, I'm not interested. I've left Egypt once and I don't want to go back. But God calls him and uses him to free the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians. Then Moses brings the people out. They cross the Red Sea. By one of God's great miracles, God parted the waters so that they could walk through on dry ground. He does that again later. And then God brings them to the mountain, and at the mountain He gives them His law, whereby God reveals who He is to the Israelites. And while Moses is leading them, they experience the holiness law. God, again, revealing Himself to the people. Then God's going to bring them into the land that they promised, that He promised Abraham, and they disobey, and their disobedience, by their act of disobedience, God punishes them. And the whole generation that was disobedient, they die off. That's Numbers. They wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. A generation passes. And then Deuteronomy, a new generation who doesn't know the law, is that Moses communicates the law to them so that they would know what it means to be God's people. Then Moses dies. And there's a new leader, Joshua. And so we have Abraham. God called Abraham. God called Moses. Now God calls Joshua. And Joshua leads the people into the promised land. And God gives them great victory in the promised land. At the end of Joshua's life, he calls the people to obey God, to not forget the Lord. And yet, They don't. They follow after other gods. And then we go through this extended period of time, if I'm remembering it, 300 years of this period called the Judges. And the Judges, as we talked about last week, was a chaotic period of time. And in the Judges, we have these local leaders that God uses to free His people. And so you have people like Othniel, you have Samson, you have Gideon, you have Jephthah. You have these characters that God uses to free His people over and over and over and over again for about a period of 300 years. And at the kind of the end of the age, if you will, of the Judges, we're now entering into Samuel. And this is another transition. Another transition by which God is desirous to use people to demonstrate His glory. And it's an interesting dynamic because here in Samuel, Israel asks for a king. And in God's eyes, the king, asking for a king, was an evil thing. It was an evil thing because the people no longer saw God as their king. They wanted a human king so that they could be like everybody else. And so it was evil in that respect. But the king was also to function as one who would lead as God's man for the people. And so he was clear back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. We're told that when the king sits on the throne, he's to write for himself a copy of the law so that he'll know how to lead the people. And that was God's desire, that the king would be one who would lead the people as God would lead the people. And so he was to administrate godly leadership. But there is an unfortunate reality that the Israelites' desire to have a human king was rejecting God as their king. Well, before we get to this transition, one of the heroes of the book of Samuel is kind of a background character, and that's the person of Samuel himself. Samuel's really the last judge of Israel. And his story is unique in that his mom, for many, many years, couldn't have any children. And one day as they were celebrating one of the feasts, is that his mom was praying that God would give her a child. And Eli, the priest at the time, he thinks that she's drunk. And she says, "Woman, give up your drink. Give up your wine." She says, "I'm not drunk. I'm pouring my heart out to the Lord." And he says, "May the Lord give you the desires of your heart." She gets pregnant and Samuel's born. And she devotes Samuel to the Lord's service for the rest of his life. And so after Samuel is weaned, she takes him and she hands him off to Eli. And allows Samuel to be raised in the temple. And so to serve the Lord. And Samuel, at a young age, is called by God. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, we get the story where Samuel is sleeping and he hears a voice, "Samuel, Samuel!" And he goes and he runs to Eli and he says, "Eli, you called me." Eli says, "No, go back and lay down." He goes back and he lays down and he says, "Samuel, Samuel!" And Samuel gets up and he runs to Eli and he says, "You called me." "No, go lay down." Again, the Lord calls to Samuel, and "Samuel, Samuel." He runs to Eli and says, "Eli, you called me." Eli now realizes the Lord is calling to Samuel. He says, "Go back and lay down, and if the voice calls to you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" And Samuel goes back, he lays down, and sure enough, I love how the text says this. "The Lord came and stood as he had done before, and called to Samuel. I love that. There's this personal character of God showing up right there on the scene and calling Samuel. And Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And God calls him to lead the people there. He removes Eli from the priesthood and his sons. His sons didn't follow in the ways of Eli. And so Eli's sons died, and Eli died on the same day. And Samuel took over that role as not only a judge, but also a priest. And in many respects, he served as the first prophet of Israel in that he served alongside of the king that God would put in that role, King Saul. But Samuel, for me, really is the hero of the book. And I just want to point him out in his call. And as you read the book, he is, for me, the hero and the person to exemplify in this book. And so don't miss Samuel's story. But here I want to read 1 Samuel chapter 8. It says, "When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice." So here you have the scene. I imagine that people loved and respected Samuel. His sons, not so much. They weren't the guys that you wanted to serve as judge over you because they would take a bribe or would seek a dishonest gain rather than justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old and your sons do not walk in your ways." This is their solution. "Now, appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." That's their solution. Give us a king. But not just a king just like everybody else. There's something striking about that reality. That earlier we suggested in our studies that God was setting this people apart to be distinctive and different. And here they're saying, give us a king so that we can be just like everybody else. Don't miss that. And I think one of the things that we have to think about in our own lives are, what are the areas in my life that I say, maybe you don't do this in a dogmatic way, but sometimes are there places in our life where we kind of suggest to God that we'd like to be less different as Christians? It's certainly an epidemic in the church today that those who call themselves Christians don't look and act all that much different than the world. One of the striking examples today is divorce rate. The divorce rate between those that call themselves Christians and those that are unbelievers or not yet Christians is virtually the same. There's hardly any difference. That should not be. And so we need to guard against wanting what everyone else is doing in the culture. That part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to follow him even when it means to look different than everyone else. Verse 6, when they said this, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. Again, this is really striking to me in that when things in our life happen that we're not excited about, or that it's different and therefore we're not sure what to do next, what do we do? What do we look to in order to help us in that situation? Well, for Samuel it says, that he experienced this as displeasing, and he prayed about it. And so I really want to end here this week that as you think about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, whatever stage of life you're at. You see, I pointed out that, we're at another point of transition. And typically the transitions in our life force us to make decisions. And when we're forced to make decisions, where does prayer, where is that in that process? I think prayer is that thing that God gave us that aligns us with what he desires to do. And so prayer is an expression of our dependency upon God. And so if you're experiencing a transition, or if you're not experiencing a transition, the reality is that you have choices to make. My question is, how does prayer shape those choices? Or does prayer allow God to align you with what he's doing? What's prayer in your life? I was in a conversation earlier this week, and the person I was talking to just looked at me and asked, "Tell me about your prayer life." I'd like to ask that to you today. Tell me a little bit about your prayer life. How's your prayer life? Is it something that you're allowing God to use to shape you to who he desires you to be and to become? God bless you. I'm praying for you. We'll see you after the new year.